Hello, and welcome to Around the Political World with John Rothman. I am your host, John Rothman. If you're a fan of the show, make sure to hit the follow button on the top right of Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening at this very moment. When you hit follow, leave a review or share an episode with a friend. It helps other people discover the show, keeps us going, as I like to point out each and every day, it expands our base. It's Friday, and so at the conclusion of this segment, we will do question and answers, which will give me a chance to expand into the areas which we all care about so much in terms of what's happening today. But I want to begin by addressing a statement made yesterday by Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense of the United States, citing in the New Testament the story of the Pharisees and their opposition to Jesus. To tell you that I was appalled would be the understatement of the century. Back in 1993, I participated writing an essay for a book called American Jews and the Separationist Faith, The New Debate on Religion in Public Life, published by the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C. I was invited to contribute an essay by my good friend and colleague, David Dallin, who is a regular listener, by the way, to this podcast. And I want to acknowledge David today in this podcast because what we wrote in 1993 for this book is as true today as it was then. I cited President Theodore Roosevelt, and I said that Roosevelt was correct when he said, and I quoted him, "Washington and his associates believed that it was essential to the existence of the Republic that there should never be any union of church and state, and such union is partially accomplished whenever a given creed is aided by the state. I hold that in this country there must be a complete severance of church and state." And Washington's essay, or his statement, went on to affirm what I believe. And so I was shocked, appalled, when Pete Hegseth used the term Pharisees. First of all, let me remind everyone that just a couple of weeks ago, we observed Good Friday. Those who are Christians understand that Good Friday deals with the fact that Jesus was crucified and rose from the dead, which is why we have Easter. If you're a Christian, that is a central tenet of your belief. But let me also point out that Good Friday was used for generations, for hundreds of years, to crucify, if you will, the Jews of today. It is very important to note that when the cry of Christ killer was raised, the idea that one could then go after the Jews of today was real. I write about this extensively in an article I wrote for Inside the Vatican, which you can get online, and Incomparable Pope, John the 23rd and the Jews. Get the extended version, and you'll see the point of what I'm saying now. The fact that the Secretary of Defense of the United States would invoke the Pharisees, the implication being that the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus, and that is precisely the idea of subversion. His implication that Jews then subverted Christ, and that today, there is a subversion of American foreign policy dealing with Iran, and therefore justifying the blast at not only Pope Leo by Pete Hegseth, but also the blast at the Pope by Donald J. Trump, the President of the United States. I want there to be no ambiguity here, and I want to cite what I wrote in this essay back in 1993. While I believe that religion and religious symbols play an important role within the American public life, I recognize and share the concerns of those strict separationists within the American Jewish community who believe that religious freedom is more secure when church and state are wholly separated. I went on to point out, and I thought it was important, that in 1992, we celebrated the 100th anniversary of the Supreme Court decision, Church versus of the Holy Trinity versus the United States, when Justice David Brewer wrote that America was indeed a Christian nation. It is appropriate to remember that as recently as the 1960s, Representative John B. Anderson of Illinois 3 times introduced to Congress a resolution proposing an amendment to the Constitution that read in part, and I quote directly, "This nation devoutly recognizes the authority and law of Jesus Christ, Savior and ruler of nations, through whom we are bestowed the blessings of Almighty God." And I hastened to point out in this essay that Anderson, the third-party candidate for president in 1980, subsequently repudiated his efforts to write Jesus Christ into the Constitution. Ladies and gentlemen, I said at the time, in this essay, I am concerned about the injection of any particular religion into our public life and institutions. I say it again today, clearly and precisely. When Pete Hegseth quotes the Constitution of the United States, that's one thing. But when he quotes the Bible, that's quite another. And I want to be clear. We have a separation of church and state in this country, which should be absolute. That was the feeling of Thomas Jefferson. And I agree with Thomas Jefferson and Theodore Roosevelt 100%. By the way, that means I'm being nonpartisan. Jefferson was a Democrat, Theodore Roosevelt a Republican. But let's be clear about something. When you have the idea that we are fighting a just war in Iran, when there is a vigorous debate over what that means, when the Catholic Church has to redefine for all of us the concept of just war simply because of a conflict between the President of the United States and the Secretary of Defense of the United States with Pope Leo, I think we've got a problem. And I would point out that the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, a Roman Catholic, is now saying that Pope Leo should not be discussing matters of theology. What? Is he nuts? Of course it is the job of the Pope to talk theology. That is what a Pope does. Now, I may agree or disagree with a Pope, but that's my feeling, my right as an American. Because in this country, we have separation of church and state. When David Dallin asked me back in the 1990s to contribute to American Jews and the separationist faith, the new debate on religion in public life, I could hardly have imagined that decades later, we would now again be debating the debate on religion in public life. Let's be clear. What this administration is advocating is deeply disturbing. I've mentioned it before, but I want to emphasize that the Secretary of Defense of this country has suggested that the war that we are fighting in Iran is a war based on a simple concept, and that is that God is on our side. I would remind Pete Hegseth and Donald Trump that when Abraham Lincoln was asked the question, his response made a lot more sense. It was not whether God was on our side, but whether we were on God's side. This is the important question which needs to be confronted today, this question of church and state in America. Let me point out as well that just this week, Donald Trump ordered Catholic charities receiving grants from the federal government that those grants be stopped. It was clearly a retaliation against Pope Leo. And I have to tell you something, it's appalling. And Congress ought to step in and say, no, we are going to renew those grants. You can't just stop them. And the fact that Congress is so passive is to me a disgrace. Do you understand? This administration using public funds to retaliate against the Catholic Church because this administration disagrees with the Pope? Appalling, shocking, unacceptable. And this to me is why I chose this morning, even though there are many issues which we could talk about, to talk about the question of the new debate on religion in public life. As David Dallin edited and wrote much of the essay that we are discussing today in his book, American Jews and the Separationist Faith, it is important to point out that that debate continues today, and it deserves to be debated and discussed, and the administration needs to be exposed for what it says. Let me point out to you that even on the question of abortion and the question of Roe v. Wade, Donald Trump, as a candidate for president, took the position that he was pro-life. It's fine if he's pro-life, but to inject those kinds of religious principles into the debate over issues affecting religion in America disturbed me profoundly. So I wanted this morning, in a clear and precise and unambiguous way, to suggest to you that there is a serious crisis taking place in our country. And the fact that we have a president, a vice president, a secretary of defense, and yes, a speaker of the House of Representatives who profess their Christian faith publicly and openly, well, it's fine with me, as long as it does not interfere with the performance of their duties. And that, to me, ladies and gentlemen, is the key. Because when you have a cry being raised in this administration that the war now being waged in Iran is a war that is justified by Christian civilization, that doesn't fly with me, and it shouldn't fly with you. Policy dealing with what we do and how we do it should be based on political realities, not on religious belief. And when Pete Hegseth had the audacity to use the example of the Pharisees to demonstrate his point about how dissent can be subversive, which is precisely what he did, I am appalled. And we, the American people, need to reject this notion. There needs to be a clear, precise, unambiguous separation of church and state. And I don't care who the public official is who invokes the name of God in defense of who we are, we need to oppose that. The ideas of Theodore Roosevelt of separation of church and state, the ideas of Abraham Lincoln, separation of church and state, the idea that this concept is so much a part of the fabric of American life. Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence and the author of Religious Liberties and the essence of who we are as a nation in terms of a separation of church and state, all of this needs to be discussed, debated, and elaborated upon as we proceed. I say this to you today with some regret. The fact that I even have to raise this issue with you is, to me, appalling. But, dear friends, as David Dallin determined in 1993, when he authored this book, edited this book on American Jews and the separation of faith, the new debate on religion in public life, we have to do it again. And the reason we have to do it again is because this administration is subverting that separation of faith. And I think that's critical for us to understand. So I wanted this morning to raise this issue, and I also wanted to say one more thing. It has to do with Pope Leo. For this president to confront the Supreme Pontiff of the Roman Catholic Church in this fashion is absolutely unacceptable. It is true that there are issues which need to be raised, but I would hasten to point out that Senator John F. Kennedy, running for president in 1960, delivered a speech before the Dallas Ministerial Association, made up of Protestant ministers, in which President Kennedy, then candidate Kennedy, defined clearly and precisely the fact that his faith was in the Constitution and he kept it separate from his religious faith. And he pointed out that no president, no public official should be determined by what their religious beliefs are. We take an oath not to religion, but to the Constitution of the United States. And that, to me, is the essence of who we are. So I wanted this morning, on this Friday, to deal with this question directly. And I want to particularly acknowledge and thank my friend and colleague David Dallin for reminding us in his book, American Jews and the Separation of Faith, the New Debate on Religion in Public Life, from 1993, that we are still debating this issue, and that is the reason I am addressing it with you today. And now let's proceed to the question and answers which have been received. Rob says this: the best pope that other religions have ever had. It appears he may have received instructions from liberal leaders. Look up David Axelrod and do a little reading. I'm familiar with David Axelrod, who was a key advisor to Barack Obama, and who has, in fact, because he's from Chicago, had an acquaintance with the Pope. And they've talked about it. But if you think Pope Leo is influenced by one individual, well, you don't get it. You really don't. The Pope has stated his conviction, which is his job. And when he is told by the Vice President of the United States not to discuss theology, what in the world do you think the Pope is supposed to do? The Pope and the Roman Catholic Church deal with theological questions all the time. But because in this country we have a separation of church and state, the fact that you may or may not agree with the Pope, that you have the right to disagree if you choose, is the essence of American democracy. Daniel D. says, being popular doesn't mean you're right. Dealing with Trump and the Pope. That's true. Popularity should not determine whether or not something is correct or incorrect in terms of your personal views. I take into account the views of religious leaders and political leaders, and yes, my listeners, and yes, those who take the time to write me. I want to know what you think, and I take it into consideration, but in the end, we are all governed by our own conscience.
What would you do if your online store converted 36% more shoppers? You could take 36% more vacation.
Another pina colada? Yes, please.
Open a new retail location with 36% more square feet.
Fantastic.
Hire 36% more help.
You're hired and you're hired.
Shopify has the world's best converting checkout, up to 36% better than other e-commerce platforms. What you do with those extra sales is up to you. Switch to Shopify today at shopify.com/listen and get a $1 trial. Shopify.com/listen.
Tim asks, John, we are 12 days away from the deadline for the War Powers Resolution. What is the obligation of the executive branch, and what action should Congress take? Well, as you know, the House of Representatives and the United States Senate have chosen to cede their powers relating to war to the President of the United States. We've seen major votes take place, and we know that in those votes, the President's position has been sustained. The War Powers Act has not been invoked. I want to emphasize again my firm belief that while a president has executive power, and that power has been used in every situation since December of 1941, we have not had a declaration of war. We've left it up to the executive. But the War Powers Act allows the Congress to intervene if the Congress chooses to. And as I've pointed out, the only time Congress ever really intervened was in the question of South Vietnam, and when no new funding was provided, and as a result, Gerald Ford, a creature of Congress, President of the United States, made the decision we could not proceed in South Vietnam without authorization from Congress, the appropriation of money. Congress, in this case, has not debated, has not discussed the merits of whether or not what we're doing is right. And I think that is a failure. I have cited before, and I will cite again, the idea that in 1967, 68, we had congressional hearings, the Fulbright hearings as they were called, where the great debate over the war in Vietnam was aired, and where the President of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, had his people prepare their statements of support for the war. But we also had Dean Rusk, the Secretary of State, and Robert S. McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, testify before Congress. And we saw, because of public encounters, the rejection of much of the Johnson policy on the war in Vietnam. To me, that is what the Congress is supposed to do. And when I suggest to you that the Congress is ceding its power, they are. And it's a mistake. And one can only imagine if this were a Democrat in the White House, what the Republicans would be doing. Phineas says, you need to name a section of the podcast, The Rothman Prophecies. Well, despite my interest in religion, I claim no powers of prophecy. I claim only that what I try to do is to address questions directly, honestly, frankly, candidly, and sometimes I'm right and sometimes I'm wrong. And if you doubt that, just ask my wife. No question about it. I've been asked this morning to talk directly about what is happening in Iran and the question of Lebanon. And so let me answer first the question of Lebanon. There is a ceasefire, but not much of a ceasefire. And the reason why I say that is because the problem is not between Israel and Lebanon as a country. The problem is between Israel and Hezbollah and Lebanon and Hezbollah. The army of God in Lebanon operates as a separate force, completely separate and distinct. And all I can tell you, and I say this with all sincerity, is that we have a real problem because Lebanon is not a normal nation. We have the battle between Sunni and Shia. We have the battle involving Phalange Christians. We have the Druze. We have, frankly, Hezbollah and radical Islam. We have a whole range of issues in Lebanon. Is a ceasefire a good thing? I have no problem with a ceasefire at all. But let's not confuse a ceasefire with peace. They are not the same thing. And whether or not this ceasefire will hold is a real question. Frankly, as long as Hezbollah and Hamas and Islamic Jihad and much of the Arab world refuse to recognize the right of Israel as a nation, we are going to continue to have these problems. Hezbollah made a statement a few days ago saying they would never agree to any resolution of this conflict that involves Israel. And all I can say is that's our problem. That says it all in a nutshell. We began this podcast by talking about the role of religion in public life. Let me point out that one of the major problems in the Middle East is the fact that radical Islam continues to reject the notion of Israel as a state and, frankly, go to war against Jews as a people. That is a simple reality, and may I say, a distortion of religion. I prefer to have Muslim leaders and political leaders like Anwar Sadat and Hosni Mubarak and others like King Hussein of Jordan and his son King Abdullah of Jordan, and yes, even to a degree, following the Declaration of Principles, the recognition by Yasser Arafat, who was then head of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, that Israel as a state, as a nation, was here to stay. When one confuses religion and politics, one has a serious problem, because one can make the case religiously that Israel has no right to exist, or that the United States should be a Christian nation, or that abortion is something that violates people's rights. The whole idea of involving religion in these matters of public policy, to me, very, very disturbing. Let me say a word about the Strait of Hormuz. Robert, and by the way, Robert, keep your question to a question. This long essay is fascinating, but really it's too much for this section. John has said for a month that the strait has been closed and controlled by Iran, but now he says Trump is closing the strait. And John complains that is wrong because Trump promised to open, not close the Strait of Hormuz. Well, let me answer your question. What seems to you to be contradictory is not at all contradictory. Donald Trump said that he was going to control the straits. The Iranians did close the strait. And now Donald Trump has put our forces in to open the strait. And yet, we aren't doing that. And when you conclude your comment by saying, don't dither, dear John, from conceding the plain, obvious conclusion that epic fury is unfolding as it should, methodically, deliberately, strategically, successfully, protected always by a Churchillian bodyguard of lies. Oh, I won't go on with this, but I do want you to understand what epic fury has demonstrated is that this president, rather than having a real policy, doesn't have a policy. The strait remains closed. And do you remember when Donald Trump said he would open the strait, not close the strait? We must recognize that 20% of the world's oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz, that this issue of this closure is going to have a huge impact on the world economy as time goes on. And so we are looking now at a very limited amount of time to get the oil out and circulating again. By the way, if the United States has more oil than any other nation in the world, maybe we should be supplying the oil. What do you think of that? There are many other issues to be discussed. I had one last question. It comes from Lisa, and it has to do with a question of the Department of Justice. Lisa, I want to answer your question directly. You ask, is the Department of Justice being weaponized by Donald Trump? The answer is yes. And that, my friends, and Lisa, is appalling. The fact that this president is misusing his power in the way that he is with the Department of Justice is something that we should reject categorically, without any question, without any doubt. This is the ultimate politicization of the Department of Justice, and that should scare us all. The fact that this week the president made clear that the Department of Justice was to exonerate the Proud Boys and others who participated in the insurrection in 2021 is, to me, appalling. And so let me be clear. I am not a fan of this administration on many levels, but the idea that this administration is proceeding now vindictively, whether it is against the Catholic charities in the United States, whether it is against the people who participated in the insurrection and clearing their names, all of this to me smacks of, well, to be honest, if there were Democrats in control of Congress, an impeachable offense. If the Senate were voting the way it ought to, by conscience, they'd be removing Donald Trump. Of course, that would give us J.D. Vance as president, and that, my friends, is something to think about. I would remind you that Richard Nixon understood that as long as Spiro Agnew was vice president, he wasn't going to be removed from office. When Agnew resigned and Ford came in, there was less fear. Let me explain that J.D. Vance invokes in many of us that same fear. And maybe he is the ultimate protection for Donald Trump. Just a thought, something to think about. I am John Rothman. It's time now to conclude this podcast and the question and answers for this week. I want to wish you all a great weekend, and I want to say a big thank you to Gogo Zoger, who makes all of this possible. I am John Rothman. Have a great weekend. I'll be back with you on Monday for more of Around the Political World with John Rothman. See you then.
If you like the show, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the show to grow. Thank you for listening.